Hello, good afternoon everyone here in Brazil. Good evening, Professor Vinicius in the UK. I would like to start greeting Professor Lucas Lima from our law school, Professor Patricia Nasser from our economics department, from our School of Economics, Professor Mauro Henrique Abreu from our dentistry school, and also the coordinator from our minor in international education. It is a great pleasure as the Vice Dean of International Affairs to be with you and to be here introducing the topic and joining you in this talk. I will now hand over to Professor Mauro, who is going to talk a little bit more about our minor in international studies and conduct together with Professor Lucas Lima and Professor Patricia Nasser this activity. Thank you, Mauro.
Thanks, Barbara. Good afternoon, everyone. Every year since 2019, the minor in international studies from our university, Minas Gerais Federal University, Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, has an inaugural class to discuss a relevant topic to our undergraduate and graduate students, and also to our academic staff. This activity has focused on the major aim of our minor. That's it, to present an up-to-date discussion with an international or comparative focus, providing a truly plural environment in national, ethnic, and value terms. Else, I'd like to invite Professor Lucas Lima to introduce our guest today. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today.
Thank you very much, Professor Mauro Henrique Abreu. For me, it's a pleasure to be with you in this afternoon, this evening, and I have the honor to introduce our very distinguished guest for this occasion, for the opening of the activities of our minor of international studies, Professor Vinicius Mariano de Carvalho. He obtained a PhD from the University of Passau, Germany, and his undergraduate and MA studies were conducted at Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora. So welcome back to Minas Gerais, Professor. He joined King's College London in 2014 before he was Associate Professor for Brazilian Studies at Aarhus University and in Denmark, where he was also the Director of the Latin American Center. At King's College London, Dr. Carvalho is Vice Dean International for the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy, and between 2020 and 2022, he was the Director of the King's Brazil Institute. Dr. Carvalho played an active role contributing to the field of Brazilian studies, founding and editing Brasiliana, Journal for Brazilian Studies, one of the most important journals in the field, and also as an editor of the Anthem Brazilian Studies Series. Dr. Carvalho created in 2022 the Observatório of Democracy in Latin America. In the fields of, in different fields of his interest of research, he occupied and covered a diverse range of areas, including literature, music, religion, history, international relations, and defense and security. Today, Professor Vinicius Mariano de Carvalho will answer a very important question. Why do Brazilian studies matter? Decolonizing knowledge in practice. Without further ado, Professor Vinicius Mariano, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation of the university. Once again, thank you, Professor Barbara, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for this introduction, and many thanks for the Federal University of Minas Gerais for inviting me to talk to you today and discuss these ideas on decolonizing knowledge, and especially around Brazilian studies. Special thanks to Mauro, Barbara, and Patricia as well that facilitate this opportunity. And immense thanks and greetings to Professor Sandra, the rector of Federal University of Minas Gerais, a good friend as well. I am living in London already, in UK for 9 years, and before also in Denmark, as Lucas mentioned. But I must say that my heart is Minas Gerais, and I normally say that Minas Gerais is not a state in Brazil, it's a state of mind. And I must say that I am constantly in this state of mind of Minas Gerais. So thank you very much to bring me to my home state as well. Well, I will share some slides here. I will not keep these slides all the time with you. We'll come back as the full screen, but it's just to give some points of departure to our conversation and also some conclusion elements as well. So I came to King's, as I said, in 2014 to work at the King's Brazil Institute. And I think it's important to give a sort of historical background on this institute and why I think this is relevant for our discussion today on terms of decolonizing. So at that time, King's decided to create what was called global institutes. We had a China Institute, Brazil, Russia, and India, International Development Institute as well, that later on became a department. We have an Australian Institute. We have Middle East Institute, one African Leadership Center, and many other centers and research references related to specific parts of the world. But some of them are country related, as I said, China, Brazil, Russia, India, and Australia as well. So that shows quite interestingly how King's College London was trying to work and look at parts of the world. And I'm still using this terminology, looking at some parts of the world. The Brazil Institute had as objectives described in our documents that we would aim to research, develop, and encourage the study of Brazil in the UK. And the objectives are served as intellectual locks for teaching and research pertaining to Brazil, foster cooperation in the study of and research of Brazil with other academic and cultural institutions, and raise the profile of Brazilian studies in the UK around the world through events and publications in English. So when I took the role of director of the institute, I looked a lot at this third point there, raise the profile of Brazilian studies, because what I was doing before is trying to understand what means Brazilian studies, what we want to say when we call Brazilian studies. And part of my academic work has been exactly around this discussion, what I'm calling here an epistemological discussion of what means to call Brazilian studies. Is that a science called Brazil? Epistemologically speaking, when we talk about studies, we normally put together some elements like methodologies, like epistemologies, like theories. Is that something that we can transform in science? In stricto sensu, speaking like that, and I was very disturbed by this preposition, study of Brazil in UK. I thought that if we continue keeping this objectification of Brazil, we would not be doing justice to what the institute can do and was doing already, and I wish we could continue doing. And I start to discuss what is this Brazilian studies, what is Brazilianist, what is Brazilianism. I can't remember the year, but I wrote an article for Brasiliana. It was in 2016 still. I wrote an article to Brasiliana, that journal that I also found in order to bring to this discussion what is Brazilian studies and how can we transform that in a sort of field that put people together around this understanding of what we are doing. And I think I start to talk about, okay, let's move this preposition, instead talking about study of Brazil only. Why we don't talk about study with Brazil or study from the Brazilian perspective as well? Then there was a battlefield. Well, I got quite a lot of reactions to these articles because some people were telling that, oh, you are trying to make that there is some exclusivity view from Brazil, and oh, what's different from what we do in science that Brazilians do differently because there is a sort of universal language of science and et cetera, et cetera. And I remember being in quite a lot of debates about this topic. And it's good today to be back and not only looking at that article, but also to reflect after some years and what happened since this provocation was put. Formally speaking, the term Brazilianist, or those who study Brazil, was used for the first time by Thomas Skidmore in this book there on the left, Brasil de Getúlio Castelo. It's the first time that someone is called Brazilianist when we talk, and Skidmore was one of those. The term was not well received in the beginning, and we are talking about the 60s, And many people criticized, and many scholars criticized this term Brazilianist as a foreigner that came to study Brazil. So was a terminology that has been used quite a lot to almost a depreciative to those who study Brazil from an external perspective. I remember finding a book by Darcy Ribeiro, in which he called the Brazilianists as one of the plagues of the Brazilian Academy in the 60s and 70s, and saying that those people that come here with a lot of money and they study us and try to explain us. Well, from that time, I start to see there is something curious here about one us and them. So Brazilian studies is for Brazilians only. Only Brazilians can talk about Brazil. What is indeed the object that we are studying when we deal with Brazilian studies? Is there a possibility to talk about Brazilianism as a field as well? And it was interesting to see other books. For instance, this one by Claudio Veiga that talks about Filias Lebesgue, and he called it a Brazilianist, a French Brazilianist, who was doing this work at the beginning of 20th century, basically, his work around Brazil. So what for me was interesting to notice, and again, I repeat that, is that even if we don't discuss about Brazilian studies, that start to create a community around. And the first group about that was the BRASA, the Brazilian Studies Association, was created in the US. It's a long story already with quite a lot of conferences, biannual conferences, and with many Brazilian scholars participating in BRASA. So it was not only foreigners looking at Brazil, and it was not only foreigners that was going to explain Brazil, but actually many Brazilians that were discussing topics of interest of Brazil, but also, and that is where the things start to get interesting when we start to look at how we Brazilians, academics from Brazil, are around the world also contributing to many discussions from Brazilian experiences and from Brazilian perspectives. And I will develop that further with us here. I want to mention also that in 2014, when we had the BRASA conference here at King's College London, we launched what would be the seeds for the Brazilian Association or Association of Brazilianists in Europe, ABRE, Associação de Brasilianistas na Europa. Together with many other scholars here in Europe, we create a steering committee to organize this association. And we had the first conference of this association in 2017 in Netherlands, in Leiden. The association, the first president was Professor Mariane Wiesenbrock, someone who has been working with Brazilian studies for quite a long time as well. The second conference was in Paris, and the third one was a virtual one because of COVID, but hosted in Praga. And the next one this year will be in Lisbon. So it is an association that is still young, but already consolidating quite a lot of these scholars that are in Europe, working with Brazil or about Brazil, but also Brazilians that are doing collaboration and sharing their work around the world. What is interesting, again, to think about that is in the beginning of this, the use of this terminology, we were talking about a time that was not so easy to circulate around the world. First of all, back in the 60s and 70s, was expensive. Second, we didn't have the same technological resources that we have at our disposal today that facilitate dialogues, exchange, and even fantastic academic collaboration around the world, as we are doing right now here. So to study something about somewhere or bringing some scholar from a place to another was a quite hard work. Looking at archives that were not digitalized. So it was quite a sort of romantic period of Brazilianism, like the anthropologists that travel around the world to discover what was going on. Well, this exotic perspective, I think, should be removed from the beginning. And not only when we think about Brazilian studies, but about all the area studies that we are today really talking more about. So what is interesting to notice is that this technological development, this facility of circulation of people, the really fantastic investments, and I'm talking specific about Brazil, but to other parts of the world as well, but fantastic investments that happen in higher education and in research that allowed really a circulation of scholars, great scholars from Brazil, young scholars from Brazil, going to many institutions and universities around the world, that start to change this perception that we objectify Brazil, we study Brazil, and we can actually understand Brazil. Then I start also to see other aspects, interesting aspects, and I am coming here to one study that was published recently. Sorry, I'm just getting to my notes here to help me to come about that. Oh yeah, a study that has been done. Let me just get back. Sorry. By Pereira Mu and Pereira Rojas, discussing what has been produced in academic journals. That was published in 2015 in the Latin American Research Review. Enrique Mu and Milagros Pereira Rojas, they did a study called Impact on Society versus Impact on Knowledge, why Latin American scholars do not participate in Latin American studies. I'm broadening here, I'm not talking only about Brazil now, but Latin America as well. In their studies, they observed that even though 80% of the world population lives in Latin America, and including Brazil, obviously, only 1.7% of academic work about Latin America is produced in this area of the world. You know? So it's okay, why scholars from Latin America are not talking about Latin America, basically, or publishing in English language is important to say here. So the authors, they argue that the limited presence of Latin American scholars in Latin American studies constitutes an immense loss for understanding of this space. And to test their hypothesis, they conduct interviews with Latin Americanists in the United States and the United Kingdom, and with academics based in Latin American countries. The study suggests that researchers based in Latin American countries do not participate effectively in the international context, meaning here international, US and UK, and Europe, because they identify themselves as agents of transformations in their own contexts, motivated to search for solutions and to respond to the social demands of the region. The academics from the US and the UK, on the other hand, see themselves as experts in the area and appear to be more motivated by the hope that their studies will contribute to collective knowledge about the region. So we see clearly two different goals in this research. And the study is perceptive and brings much light to the comprehension of the academic sphere in countries called Latin America. And the understanding that research for these countries have about what it means to study Latin America, and we can shift this Latin America to Brazil here. The conclusions undo some preconceived ideas, such as the idea that Latin American academics do not participate actively in the international academic community, again, meaning Europe and US, because of a limited grasp of the English language, insufficient training about academic publication, or lack of resources. That's not the case. One particular point, and that I quote here, and that stands out for me, is that, quoting them directly as you have there, our research shows that even for those who have training and language skills, UK and US journals, themes and topics of interests, many times highly theoretical, are not their main concern. As one of our interviewees said, referring to UK, US journals, their research questions are not our research questions. I think this is really remarkable. I think it's point out very much for how we were in the need of a certain decolonialization of research here and decolonization of area studies. I think we have been used a lot to admit this sort of area studies and let the construction of departments, institutes like mine, to be that place where we study one place specifically. And many people ask me also, oh, do you have also Brazil institutes in Brazil? I normally say, well, the entire Brazil is a Brazil institute. It is where we are producing knowledge for Brazil, but not only for Brazil, but from Brazil, for areas and contexts that are relevant to the entire world today. If we look at the main concerns that we are facing in the world today, climate change, for instance, urban development and massive urban growth, urbanizations, deforestations, social inequalities, issues of security and defense, we are definitely talking not only about Brazilian issues, but global issues as well. So we don't need necessarily to look only, or when we are doing research about Brazil, we are not necessarily looking only at this geographical context, but also looking about the world in general. And I start to think a lot about that, and especially when I was reading at that time, Edward Said, Orientalism again. It gave me a sense that sometimes we need a sort of discussion on Latin Americanism and Brazilianism. If we could include those two together, I am not going here with you today to discuss if Brazil should be or not should be part of a Latin American studies or a Latin American institute. That's another discussion, a very complex one as well. And part of my article on Brazilian studies, I discussed that point, but I think there are many other things to take into consideration. But in any case, just think about Latin American/Brazil, or Latin Americanists/Brazilianists, Brazilianism, Latin Americanism. I think we may need to rethink and to come back to some discussions on coloniality in research and coloniality in knowledge. So I went to Said, again, Edward Said, and he says that Orientalism can be a classical tradition of studies, the manner of viewing the Orient, the Western mode of dominating, restructuring, and exercising power over the Orient, a combination of ideas restricted to values presented in a generalized way, mentality, characteristics of the Orient, corporate institutions of knowledge responsible for perpetuation of stereotypes, an archstyle of thought based on the ontological distinction between the Orient and the Occident, and the system of representations of the Orient patent in science, conscience, and in the policies of the empire. Okay, this is talking about Orient and the contribution of Said to this post-colonial thought. It's very important. So I just did a small exercise, and where we see Orient, I changed to Latin America, and we could also change that to Brazil. And I think Latin Americanism, sorry, it's missing I am there, can be a classical tradition of study, the manner of viewing Latin America, the global north, and I change here Occident to this global north, mode of dominating, restructuring, and exercising power over Latin America, a combination of ideas restricted to values presented in a generalized way, mentality, also characteristics of Latin America, corporate institutions of knowledge responsible for perpetuation of stereotypes, an archstyle of thought based on the ontological distinction between Latin America and the North, and the system of representations of Latin America, patent in science, conscience, and in the policies of the empire. We can change this empire for another new models of imperialism as well. So I did this exercise just as provocation, as I said, because what I think is in the contemporary contexts of discussions and practices of decolonizing curricula, decolonizing knowledge, we need really to start to break these boundaries and start to see that Brazilianists are not those that are experts on Brazil from looking from abroad, but much more. It's everyone, every scholar and academic that through their sciences, through their works on natural sciences, anthropology, history, whatever, they are bringing together a perspective, a socio-historical, cultural perspective, a result of this experience of what we are calling Brazil. That is also very plural. That is not univocal. That's not only one way of from Brazil to see the world. It's to understand that because of this socio-cultural, historical cultural reality that forged what we call today Brazil, and this plurality that is result of this conflictuous history and this constant conflictuous construction of society, it may give tools, lenses, instruments that help to look in dialogue with other parts of the world, and consequently not necessarily being a place to be studied, but a place from which will also come contributions in terms of looking to global problems from this Brazilian perspective as well. And I also want to quote the last quote that I will bring here before I come out of this presentation. My colleague Derek Pardue, who took over when I left Denmark as a associate professor at Aarhus University and came to King's, he was the one who was hired to teach there as well. In one of his books, Derek, he said something that for me was very interesting. He was talking about his experience coming to Brazil. He said, I left the United States to Brazil in 1995, looking for a different way of thinking about the world. I remember having conversations with graduate students, librarians, and faculty members at PUC and USP of São Paulo, PUC São Paulo and USP. I wanted them to point me in the right direction so that I could become acquainted with Brazilian paradigms on social theory. While, of course, the content of the research project discussed was Brazilian, new paradigms were not forthcoming. In fact, the more I studied and participated in seminars, I realized that Brazilian scholarship in the social sciences, especially anthropology, was and continues to be, for the most part, depending on trends in British history, French sociology, and American cultural anthropology. I remained frustrated until I discovered that dependence does not require imitation. Dependency and adaptation are not, of course, mutually exclusive. Many early Brazilian scholars like Freire, Buarque de Holanda, and Cunha distinguished themselves by reworking European and US theories of culture, which themselves were based on observations or imaginations about other places, such as Brazil. In fact, relations of dependence, whether is in intellectual theories or in popular culture, reflect much more about relative positions in transnational markets of material and ideological production than about issues of cultural meaning of use. I think these observations that Derek Pardue made, they are perhaps a good way of coming to a conclusion of what I want to make as first presentation here before we enter in a discussion. I think since I wrote that paper is not a long time ago, but yes, times move quick, and also from the time that Derek wrote this page in his book, we have seen quite a lot of transformations and quite a lot of dialogues being happening or developing between what's going on in Brazil and in other parts of the world. But most importantly, it's starting to see more and more in Brazil Institute here at King's and the work that we are doing here, both at the Institute with the Anthem Brazilian Studies Series and with Brasiliana. It is creating a platform much more than objectifying Brazil, but creating a platform where the scholarship produced in Brazil about Brazil and about the world will dialogue in the same level of epistemic reconnaissance, acknowledgement, than what is produced in global north. And it's not a Quixotescan battle that I am proposing here. It's not an us against them here, but it's much more a comprehension that what we have been doing in Brazilian scholarship has already make a lot of transformations in how we build up this great building of knowledge that we are doing here. And I should really mention as examples, the great steps, for instance, that the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, the UFMG, is doing historically in terms of decolonizing knowledge. I want to highlight the Saberes Tradicionais program that the university has, the traditional knowledge program that the university has implemented, in which different epistemologies, different syntagmas, not only paradigms, but different syntagmas have been introduced as the same level of scientific value than the other coming from Global North. I think what we are seeing in this moment is, I'm calling this transformation of syntagma, because it's not only shift of paradigms using the same grammar to talk about science and knowledge, but is really understanding that new grammars can also explain the world and help the world to construct or to make transformations, either in social aspects, but also in the so-called natural science aspects, that will really be meaningful and transformative for societies. That's the main goal of what we do in science in general. And I think that's the important aspect when we talk about Brazilian studies today. It's not only objectify Brazil as a place of study, and it's not only prove that we can do science as they do, as well as they do in the North, in Europe, but that we can also introduce these new syntagmas of knowledge, these new syntagmas that are results of the pluralities of epistemologies that constitutes what is Brazil, this indigenous knowledge, this Afro-Brazilian knowledge, this the knowledge resulting of the confrontation, the hard historical confrontations of power that the country has lived, but they also produced a fantastic model, a fantastic language in which we can speak it, and we can also do and construct and build up this transformation in society that we want so much. We may see through this knowledge, through these different languages and grammars, we may see probably many solutions for issues like climate change, as I mentioned before, about environment conservation, about ways of living with each other in society that will be not so dependent on same models of societal organizations that came from imposition of colonial powers as well. So that's, I think, the big transformation that we can have here. And again, I'm very proud today of for sharing with you some of the ideas that I have about that. I'm sorry that was not so organized in terms of a clear and coherent presentation, but much more a sharing of ideas. And I hope that these ideas can bring us to further discussions that will enrich this perception. And finally, in the last words that I want to say before we open to this conversation is, it's about time. It's about time for us to understand that the colonization of curricula, it doesn't need to be understood as a challenge or a threat to traditional global North powers, knowledge of powers. And we really need to be very humble in academia to understand that we may be missing a lot if we only look at the world through the traditional lenses that we were trained for to do. I finish with this here. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity of sharing these ideas with you, and open now to learn your questions and to hear your questions, and also contestations about what I just have said here. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Vinicius, for your brilliant discussion and presentation. We are very happy with all your reflections about these topics. They are very provocative for us. And all the time I was thinking and rethinking about what we do at the university as academics, as researchers, as professors, and what we are lecturing to our students, and if we are copying, and if we are going advanced, and if we are taking the opportunity for learning in a different perspective to change our country and giving the world the contributions for our knowledge developed in a Brazilian perspective. So I write down on the chat in the YouTube that all the questions are very welcome. And if students and academics would like to write down in Portuguese, we can try to translate in English. And I'd like to open to my colleagues, Patricia and Lucas and Barbara, to make some questions and comments. Thank you.
Patricia would like to go first. I have my questions, but I do not want to monopolize.
Sorry, Lucas, I asked to open my camera because I don't know, I cannot do by myself. So I asked someone who is monitoring this presentation online. Okay. But please go on. No,
you can go first. Now we are seeing you, yeah.
Okay, I it's not exactly a question, but I can open some ideas to start the discussion. And when I was a student, undergrad, or even when I was doing my PhD, I can admit that I rarely I can hear this word Brazilianist. It's something that when we are a student here in Brazil, our professors don't say this word. So this is something that we have to understand why exactly. And thinking about your presentation, I also had the opportunity to read your text. One thing that I also wanted to open here we have some have some ideas about is why we don't have area studies, these area studies here in Brazil. Now we have something about China, experts about Latin America, but we don't say this area studies. I come from the area of international political economy, international relations, and it's difficult that a colleague by himself say that he studies something or is an expert in China or only this, because sometimes we have to teach many things or research in many topics because this is the reality. So my question is why we as Brazil as a global actor, I think that in the last 12 years, many things changed in the international relations departments here in Brazil. We have many students research about this. Our external policy changed and changed again, and we don't know exactly what will be in the next future. But I think perhaps many people are studying Brazil and the international relations of Brazil, but this area studies exactly, it's not something that we have in our departments. So this is my first idea that I want to share with you, why we still don't have this here in Brazil. We cannot say this, we have an expert in something related to Brazil in departments of international relations, only external policy or international relations of Brazil, and Brazil is still the object. So it's an idea that I want to share, thinking about all the topics that Professor Vinicius has presented.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Your questions really help a lot to go further in this conversation. Well, I think the question of in Brazil, we don't talk about Brazilianists. I think is exactly because when they were start to be used, the term was actually American scholars coming to study Brazil. And that's explain also the area studies. Area studies was something invented to almost a colonial perspective. Let's become experts in parts of the world so we can understand better what to do politically there, economically there, and replicate some models of colonialism that we saw very much after the Second World War in particular and during the Cold War. So it was a very political strategical approach to let's learn the other in order to control and dominate. So in some ways, so in certain aspect, is actually good that we don't have area studies in Brazil. If so, we are not replicating this model of I am expert in a place. That means that I can easily understanding or support some approach that can become colonial as well. I think it's a big challenge for us, academically speaking, in all terms. We need to be very careful on this sense, because we can replicate colonialism even from the perspective of the area studies, from this perspective of the order that has been studied. No, there are one thing that caught my attention, for instance, when I started to studying or working abroad and teaching about Brazil and dialoguing with Brazil and being called an expert in Brazil. What I refuse, I don't call myself an expert in Brazil. I prefer to say that I am someone studying with Brazil and learning with Brazil than being an expert. It's impossible, especially in the context of Brazil, be an expert in such a complex and plural country. So I don't say that I am an expert in Brazil, but the fact that I am looking at this dynamics, social, historical, cultural dynamics that Brazil has and has in interactions with other parts of the world, helps me to see that, we should probably promote more this plural, multidisciplinary approach of looking at issues of Brazil from within, from Brazil within. And maybe we could contribute to that also becoming a Brazilianist for inside, well, not for outside, but for inside. I still think that we need to learn a lot still with the traditions and the knowledge and language of indigenous people in Brazil. I still think that those cultures and people are quite objectified in academia. Very few examples where we are really dialoguing in the same level of status of knowledge with those communities. And I think that's a strong and important step that we can do in order to become a Brazilianist to inside. Not necessarily looking at big pictures, but about this plurality of knowledge and epistemologies that each one of those indigenous languages bring and represent as well. Because they are not simply language, they are epistemologies, they are cosmologies, they are ontologies. So multiplying that, it is a sort of Brazilianism. It's multiplying Brazilianism as well. So I think that is, we should have area studies to inside and not only area studies to outside. But this area studies that is not to look and observe and objectify, but is much more to see how we can, together with them, I will use this word again, multiply the possibilities that we have to look at global issues. Because today we understood that there is no more local problems here. The issues that we are facing everywhere in the world, they can, the knowledge acquired, produced, and the reflections upon the world that come from any community in this world has impact in other parts of the world. So we should probably be more holistic in this sense, and and avoid this colonial perspective. And what I'm saying, avoid this colonial perspective, is because it is dangerous. We in academia, we are dangerous people. We think that we know better and more than other people. We receive certifications for that. We get our grades. We are proud of being called professors and doctors and postdoctors and super post hyper doctors. And then it's a sort of medals and ranks that we put, badges to show how important I am, and you should respect my knowledge. Yes, we should, but it's not so like that only. Yeah, and that's the important thing I think Brazilian studies can contribute today from inside Brazil. It's not replicate and perpetuate hierarchies in terms of knowledge. I really didn't answer your question directly and objectively, but yeah, I think we can become Brazilianists without being colonialists, as it was when the word came into term. And the area studies that we need to revolutionize nowadays is exactly that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. What I think is that if we don't have people that study or departments that have this area studies, we cannot make good international policies or external policies, because we don't understand the external, exactly. So that is why I asked, and I understand from your explanation, also by your explanation, your text, from the 60s, what do you mean? Now we have not to understand that what they say is true, or this is like this, should be like this.
Yeah, and you said something very important in terms of international relations. We can use the example of the Portuguese-speaking countries. So sometimes, and we have today people that are working and studying with scholars in Angola, Mozambique, also Portugal, and Timor, etc. But we should not think that just because we speak Portuguese, we understand them. Those countries, they have socio-historic cultural realities that shared some elements with us, but doesn't make the same. As well as Latin America, we share a lot with Latin American countries, but they have other socio-cultural realities, historical realities that we need to intersect and see how much we are missing if we try to put in this generalization. And this is so interesting as well, because like even Portuguese studies, I'm not talking about language, I'm talking about Portugal. So do we study Portugal in Brazil? We used to have a North American Institute as well at King's, so I'm just making this joke because of that.
Thank you very much.
Mauro, may I ask a question? Vinicius, thank you for a beautiful presentation. I completely agree with you that the whole Brazil is an immense institute for studying Brazil and Brazilianists, and we discovered that in initiatives like this, when we have to have contacts and partnerships with other institutions in Brazil, and it's the splendid position to be in the university right now. So I completely agree with this assertion of yours. But there is something that from time to time, being part of this minor, I ask myself, this is a group of Brazilians speaking in English, and we are trying to create initiatives in English to internationalize our university, because this is one of the goals and one of the objectives brilliantly conducted by Professor Aziz and Professor Barbara. But this program is an initiative to internationalize, and we have a strong politics of language here. So it's interesting that we have access, and we only have voice sometimes when we publish in certain language, not only English. It's not a question of English. I would like to hear your view about this politics of language in this context of decolonization, and how do you see the position of the Portuguese as a language, if this is changing, not changing, this perception that everything should be published in English or French or European language. How is your perception with regard to politics of language? And is this a kind of self-criticism? Because I'm very proud to be part of this minor. I think this is a very intelligent initiative. But at the same time, we are trying to be decolonial using a colonial language. How do you see this apparent paradox?
Yeah, good point, Lucas. Yeah, well, the question is, we speak with accent. We all speak with accent. We here in UK, the center of the English language, the name England. So when I walk in my university, that's an English university, I speak with people with several accents all the time. And Teresa Caldeira, in the book she wrote, City of Walls, I think, in the introduction, she said something that I think is amazing. She said, well, I don't only speak with accent, I think with an accent. And I think we all do that. When we are using another language that is a tool, we think with an accent. And it is a sort of exercise of appropriation as well. Yes, it's the language of the North, it's an European language. Historically, it's the language of power. It is imposed globally because of power, because of imperialism and colonialism, but it doesn't belong anymore to one people, one group. When we become multilingual, we became also, we multiply our structures of thinking. And we transform our own language. We transform as well this language that we are speaking. And we transform with this perspective of the language that we came from. So when I write in English, I can still see reminiscences of Brazilian Portuguese syntaxes there. And people say, oh, that's not right or wrong in English, but it's communicative. And we are communicating with that. We are doing what languages are for, to communicate. So preciosism, I should not say that coming from language, and from letras, but to be preciosist about language is a sort of keeping these boundaries of who knows and who doesn't know. And I normally say that I speak vagabundo English because it is full of grammar errors, but these grammar errors, they are not errors, they are accents in the way of shifting this language, and in this shifting the language is bringing this other perspective. That's the perspective that I was formed on, and we do that constantly. And this is a great exercise when we are in an environment where we need to find a language, a common language to talk about, to talk together. Yeah, I am a Latinist. I taught Latin in the beginning of my academic career, and I was always amazed reading texts in Latin from universities in Europe of the 19th century until where people wrote a lot of their theses in Latin. And yeah, we see in Latin also the accents. We see a German Latin, we see a French Latin. So it is a Latin that's the language of no one, used to be the empire, but became a common language and still conserved in the university until the 19th century. Think about that, how conservative we are, because the Roman Empire fell a long time ago, and we insist in using Latin as the language of the university for such a long time, for a common communication. English surpassed that, French for a period. English today is the language of communication. It's a tool, and I think doesn't belong anymore to one country, one people. It's like we learn how to drive a car. If you need to do some job, you learn English to communicate with a broader audience. And you can see that, oh, it's colonial. Yes, it is in its origin. But now we appropriate that. The academic English language is a language of the world. It doesn't belong to one country. And I'm sorry for those that are monolingual in English language, that they are missing a lot what other languages can bring to our knowledge. Yeah. So multiply our language is a great advantage. And I'm really sorry for those who think that just because I speak English as my mother tongue, I don't need to learn other languages. They are losing, they are missing. And we are richer in this point. And that, I think, is my reflection around language. And yeah, that's it.
May I insist on how do you see the role of Portuguese? I completely agree with you, and thank you for this very elaborate answer. But how do you see the role of Portuguese today in Brazilian studies?
Which Portuguese? No, the Brazilian Portuguese, and which Portuguese inside Brazil? Because again, that's another important point here. Are we talking about a disciplinated grammatically Portuguese that is cultivated and is also part of a replication of structures of power inside the Brazilian society? Those who speak good Portuguese and those that speak bad Portuguese, if we could use this terminology. Yeah. So, and again, the role is we have today in Brazil, differently from 20 years ago, a mass of Brazilian scholars all over the planet. Here in Brazil Institute, I'm happy when I get quite a lot of Brazilians coming to talk here and struggling with English, because it's not a struggling to learn English, is much more, there's a struggle to make sure that my voice will be heard. And it is true Portuguese. Yeah. So we could say, oh, we need to and I should say that we need to improve more or promote more Portuguese language around the world. Yes, we need, but we need to promote many other languages and all the languages. And we need, especially in the case of Brazil, not forget about the indigenous languages in Brazil. We should never forget that we are sitting in a pot of gold in terms of knowledge. When we look at the indigenous languages of Brazil, it's a pot of gold, because with the language came, as I said, epistemologies, cosmologies, ontologies. And I think we should, at the same passion we have for the Brazilian Portuguese promotion, we should have about learning, even inside Brazil, Brazilians that are not indigenous people that have that as first language. We should have much more learning of indigenous language. It's the same value as any other language. Oh, but English is important for business. Yeah, exactly. But there are many other important things that we can learn with other languages.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucas.
Mauro, Lucas, we have two questions in our chat that were sent from students. I don't know if Mauro or Lucas want to take a look at them. And I think Vinicius can also.
I can read it. Julia Moreira is asking what are the initiatives, the internal initiatives for improve the exchange between production and traditional institutes of UFMG and the productions and syntagmas of the program of the traditional knowledge. Julia, I don't know internally in UFMG, as I'm not from there, but again, I just want to reinforce the fact that this program of traditional knowledge is sitting in a university. That's the institution of knowledge power. We still depending on a university to give us a title. So the fact that you have that in UFMG, it's a clear sign that something is moving and changing. Yeah, universities are very conservative institutions, and they move as elephants, very slow. And yeah, change will happen, but we need to start doing that. And you have this privilege of having started that, and you must be proud of it. And again, I think we would here at King's, and I'm not the director of Brazil Institute anymore. We have a new director who is a fantastic scholar as well, Andres. I'm sure that you would share the same thought here. We would love in King's to dialogue more with this traditional knowledge institutional program that you have there in UFMG, because we have a lot, and UK has a lot to learn in this dialogue. So Mauro and team from the International Cooperation UFMG, you already have a point in the agenda for our collaboration in the future here. And I have a question for Marcelo Garcia, that thank you very much for presentation. It made me think that frequently in social studies at Brazilian University, we can see researches about traditional communities or other vulnerable groups, also being stereotyped and objectified, as we Brazilians may seem to some foreign research. You are absolutely right, Marcelo. And it is an important step to move forward and start to, when especially in social science and humanities, we should try to avoid the objectification of what we study. If we are not transformed in this study as well, then something is wrong here.
Vinicius, if I may just make a comment, I thought it was really interesting. Thank you so much for your talk and for your insights. I really, being a linguist, I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned your objectives and you made a linguistic analysis, especially talking and touching upon the prepositions. And it caught my attention when you mentioned, for example, studies in English, and something at the beginning when you mentioned that, I had the same impression that Lucas had, making the similarity with publishing in English and how important it was to showcasing these studies in English and raising the issue of this not compulsory, but this necessity of the publications in English as showcasing and amplifying or extending the readership of those publications and those studies. I thought that was interesting that you mentioned in that perspective as well. I like the use of the preposition with, which meant for me searching for collaboration or doing together or searching for partners in these studies as well. And another, something that also made me think it was from the Brazilian perspective, a sense of ownership. It's like we are owning, it's an ownership of the studies that are produced or from our voices as well from the Brazilian studies. I don't know if I am going to the right direction, if I am following the same line of thought that you were mentioning when you were thinking about that. But I really liked as well the new syntagmas of knowledge. I like the term that you coined and that you use it. And in my mind, would that be the same of, am I right to think that if I am thinking about new syntagmas of knowledge, it's the same thing or similar of creating new narratives for Brazilian studies or looking for new narratives and taking ownership for this for these new narratives? Would that be similar or would that be a new perspective as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't thought a lot about this before, but again, if we understand narratives as a form of tell the world or tell our experience with the world, then we need to multiply perspectives of this narrative as well, because they are different. So yeah, hermeneutically speaking, we always think like, okay, I interpret the world with the instruments that I have and with the perspective that I have. So that's what I interpret the world. Look, when we were in COVID time and knowing people through the lenses of the computer, how surprised we were when we met people for the first time. I say, wow, you are much taller than I imagined, or you are much thinner than we met. So I think that's a good example of how much the shift of perspectives or the moving around of perspectives, the multiplication of hermeneutical horizons are a need when we talk about decolonizing knowledge, because this shift of position, it's also a shift that can happen through language and through different language that we have as tools and different ways of tell the story, if you prefer called narratives, because they will multiply again from the different perspectives that we have. And then as a good hermeneut, we should always also think there is not only a univocal truth about what we see in the phenomena. The combination of these perspectives will give us a broader view or understanding of the phenomena that we are looking at. So it's the good point, because it's not only the point of view, but the point of how I ordain what I see and tell that, narratively speaking. Yeah, and narrative understood as that, as interpretation, not explanation, because that's another big problem that we sometimes we mix up. We think that narrative is an explanation and don't see that as an interpretation. Yeah.
Mauro?
Okay. I was thinking and rethinking about all the comments and the reflections. And I was wondering about the future new hot topics about this area, if I could say about that, about Brazilian studies. What will be the future? What will be included in Brazilian studies? I'm from public health perspective, so if public health in an international comparative, I think Brazil made a wonderful and a very challenging health system in the world, with some ideas from public services from the UK, the Canadian system, but also incorporating very new strategies. I am a dentist, and this week our president enacted a law that included, for example, oral health as a right for every Brazilian citizen. I think it's completely different from all over the world. When I talked with public health professionals from different countries, they say, just for children. I said, no, it's for every citizen. So it's a Brazilian example that probably in the future we could discuss and make some discussions and reflections with other countries and other professionals. I was just wondering about what are the future for Brazilian studies, and if you could include it, Vinicius, for example, some different areas that traditional are not included in these points. What do you think about that? And I'm going to stop with my comments, and just to say that it was an honor for us here at the UFMG to receive you, and hopefully in the future we can have you not only by Zoom, but presentially. And I think for our undergraduate students, it will be fantastic to increase their formation and their international relationships. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mauro. And I unfortunately cannot tell a lot about the future, because I think the directions that the world takes, it's unpredictable, and COVID told us very much about that. And I think also many of the experiences of overpassing that pandemic together, and we tend to forget that was just around the corner a few days ago, basically, that we were locked down because of something that we didn't know what was clearly, and we didn't have instruments to deal with. But many of these experiences around the world coming from the hard science to find vaccines, but also to mental health issues, how to find ways to deal with these issues that came from several parts of the world, and groups that found way to worship those that have faith, to worship together in that new reality. All these things shows us how important are area studies in a comparative perspective. It's not the word that I want here, but in a collaborative perspective and non-comparative one, because comparatively we tend to say what is better or worse. I think what we need to do now, it's what we can add, and Brazilian studies can add a lot in all areas of knowledge that we have, and even in those areas that we still don't have as an academic area, because knowledge and the way that we observe the world is diverse and also change. So we can include in Brazilian studies what we think that is important to be this cooperative, this cooperation around building up knowledge together. I would like to thank you all for this invitation. It's a great honor, and it's always a great pleasure to be, even if not physically, in my state of mind of Minas Gerais, in this plural state of Brazil. We used to call here in Kings the heart of Brazil. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Professor Vinicius. The honor and the pleasure is all ours. We are very, as I said before, happy to have you here. Every semester we have a special moment, like an opening session, an opening lecture for our minor in international studies, and it was very important to have this topic this semester, this year, opening our minor in international studies. I would also extend my thanks to Professor Lucas Lima, to Professor Mauro, and Professor Patricia. They are the ones responsible for managing, organizing, and coordinating this minor in international studies. Without their work, support, and help, they are coordinated by Professor Mauro. It would be possible to carry on with all the demands for this set of discipline for this program. So Professor Aziz and myself are very grateful for your time, for your expertise, for all the effort that the three of you are putting in this program. I would also like to thank Ricardo Bruno for his technical support. I extend my thanks to our students that were here with us. Thank you, our university as well. And I do hope that we can still interact, and we do have interesting future plans for both institutions. Our cooperation will flourish for sure. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
See you soon again.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye, everyone. Bye. Thank you all.